Around the same time, a little bit later, roughly about 20 years later, also there appeared a young man by the name of Ilgok or Yi. Ilgok is often paired, even though he's a younger contemporary of Chege, he's often paired with a different way or approach to the understanding of Neo-Confucianism within the Chosŏn dynasty. Tege's philosophical position was that principle always maintains itself, even in the circumstances where physical endowments and circumstances might militate against it. Principle is sacrosanct. Ilgok or Yi was just the opposite. He said that the notion of an absolute principle prior to the experience of a set of circumstances is untenable. It is only within circumstances that we learn out what principles are. Okay? In other words, we have to have experience of life before we can formulate principles about those experiences. Tege said, no, all we have to know is the principle, right? The principles of the ordered universe can be known prior to any experience we have of the actual life. Ilgok, on the other hand, was just the opposite. We never know what is a principle. We never know what is the absolute value until we have an experiences. Ilgok is a bit of a utilitarian. Okay, Ilgok was born in Kangwon in 1536. Ilgok, unlike Tege, actually came from a very high-ranking family. His father had been fourth state councilor, the Chosŏn within the reign of the king at this time. His mother, Shin Sayim-dang, was an accomplished artist and calligrapher. He was also, Ilgok was the grandnephew of Igi, the prime minister, who became prime minister 10 years after Ilgok was born and remained so until he was 12 years old. So Ilgok came from a very prominent family, already located within the central government. Unlike Yi Huang, Ilgok, in fact, loved to serve in government. And he couldn't wait to get to Seoul, and rarely actually left government. So he didn't resign. He would take another and so forth. He is, again, like many of his time, he passed the civil service literary exam at the age of 12. Then later, like Yi Huang, began to develop a private academy for his own students. At the age of 16, his mother died, and so he retired from life and stayed in Gangwon-do for 3 years. And while he was there during his mother's mourning period, apparently he became interested in Buddhism. So he would go visit Buddhist monks and talk to them and studied a lot of Buddhism. At the age of 20, 4 years later, he left the mountains where he was studying and then went to the national academies to study Confucianism. Ilgok married at the age of 22, and then there's a very famous story telling us about Ilgok, that upon his marriage, he happened to invite a Buddhist monk to the ceremony, to see the ceremony and so forth. And he and the Buddhist monk got into a conversation that lasted all night. So poor Ilgok's wife spent her first night of married life alone, while Ilgok is, out debating philosophical ideas and so forth. I don't know if that's really true, but it's one of these apocryphal stories. He passed very special exams with top honors, and in fact, one of his last exams was based upon a thesis in which he wrote a book called The Book of the Chondochek, or literally The Book on the Way of Heaven, which is a literary masterpiece. It also traces the notion of how heaven is understood by Confucians all throughout the ages. He continued to receive top honors in exams. He was also a palace examinee. That is, every 10 years, the king was allowed to have a special examination for the best scholars, and he passed both of those and then received reward. His father died when he was age 26, and at age 29, he was appointed, and that's pretty young, he was appointed as envoy to China. So he went with the national embassy to the Ming capital. In that embassy to the Ming Dynasty, he in fact was document officer, so he was in charge of all the documents. He himself is a writer of the Myeongjong Annals, that is the annals section of the Chosŏn Dynasty history for Myeongjong. That's what he wrote. He wrote the whole annals for that particular king. And at the age of 34, he authored a treatise called the Tonghwa Mundap, an 11-article political memorial devoting, clarifying what he intended Reich's government could do and could be achieved. Okay, E had a variety of jobs. He not only worked in the central government, but also worked in provincial government. He was very well respected by the king, and by the age of 40, relatively young years, in fact, he had raised to the highest position available to members of his rank. Um, in his many documents, theses were presented to the royal court, and when political conflicts escalated, he returned home and, in fact, left the court. Following, though, his return, he devoted time to, like Yi Huang, to instructing students and, in fact, writing materials. At the age of 45, he also returned to the government and held various ministerial positions, as well as recorded political events and wrote history. King Sunjo, of course, was noncommittal in his attitude towards Yi and oftentimes remained neutral when Yi, in fact, took an unpopular position. Okay? According to legend, Yi had a pavilion, a kind of resting platform, built near the ford of the Imjin River in his lifetime, and instructed his descendants to set it ablaze when the king had to flee northward. This is in reference to the as yet unanticipated invasion of Korea by the Japanese. And in fact, his heirs were to set it ablaze when the king had fled northward from Seoul to provide a guiding beacon. So the king would see the burnt building and then be able to know where they could go. This, in fact, did take place years later in the Imjin invasion when Hideyoshi Toyotomi, in fact, invaded Korea and burned down half the country. Again, this might be apocryphal, but that somehow or other he had precognition of the invasion of Korea. Unlike Yi Huang, of course, was a philosopher, in fact, who was much more sympathetic towards Buddhism, and many of his ideas are directly taken out of Buddhist scriptures. He did not, like Yi Huang, believe that Buddhism or Taoism were antithetical to Confucian ideas. And in fact, in his description of Buddhism, he said that Buddhism and Taoism serve different purposes. It is by confusing their purposes that we find antithesis, meaning that if you think of Buddhism in terms of one sector of life, it serves it well. If you think of Taoism as another, serving another sector of life, it does it well, and Confucianism covers everything in between. It's not the case that you have to exclude the two in order to maintain the one. So unlike many of his contemporaries, Yi, in fact, considered that there was something good and worthy of imitation within the Buddhist and Taoist traditions. Unlike Yi Huang, also Yi enjoyed his time in politics. He was an active official, both working in the capital and as well as in the provinces. He is responsible for 25 different local contracts that he wrote for villages in which he lived, and was very much dedicated to the idea that people should take care of themselves. And that's what village contracts are about, that people should not have to depend upon the central government for their welfare, but that people could, at the village level, band together to create funds and to produce educational systems so that everyone in the village would, in fact, succeed. He also had a very different attitude towards the body. In his he repudiated the teachings of Yi Huang, even though Yi Huang had been his teacher. He believed that the human body was not disordered, that in fact intentionalities that arise out of the human body, because the body itself is good, that in fact intentionalities that arise from the body are not the cause of evil. The body does not constrict. If I'm hungry and somebody tells me I should be studying, it is better to follow my hunger and alleviate my hunger than to go off and study. All right? Ultimately, to deny one's hunger in order to read books was wrong, bad for the body. So he was, again, not as strict as Yi Huang, and in fact believed that the body was a good thing. He also believed, as did many Buddhists of his time, that the mind was sufficient unto itself. That is, that if we understood the principle of one thing in the world, this would inevitably lead to the understanding of all the principles of the world. This seems a bit strange, but it's a kind of mysticism. That is, that we don't have to go out and investigate all happenings in the world in order to understand their principles. We can vicariously be told about happenings in the world and then we can investigate their principles in our own mind. Okay? This, again, looks very Buddhist. That is, that one can imagine oneself in a set of circumstances which one has not experienced and analyze those circumstances in order to find out what the right response is. So, again, very much like a Buddhist, doing the same thing. That is, that you did not have to actually engage yourself in all circumstances to understand the principles behind them. You can do it in your own mind. Okay? And E is, in fact, said to reputed very much like a contemporary of his, man by the name of Wang Yangming in China, that in fact we need not leave the confines of our study in order to understand the world. Because we can, in fact, when we understand one principle, we can therefore understand all principles. Kind of mystical and not real clear what that means, but he's very clearly in that side. He also, Wang, unlike unlike Tege, just believed that men, especially scholars, should in fact enjoy themselves. He enjoyed living. He had several girlfriends and so forth. He liked to travel, but he did not maintain the kind of rigorous stoical approach that Wang was well famous for. So yeah, left behind a whole series of poems which he inscribed on tavern walls, and those have been collected and so on and so forth. Very much like our friend, what's his name? Harvard Decanon Yugo Shinakta. Du Wei Ming. Du Wei Ming, yeah. Like Du Wei Ming. Du Wei Ming is a modern neo-Confucian. He's at Harvard and Berkeley and so on and so forth. But every time I meet him, it's usually in some sort of bar in Asia. Yi was very much like that. He liked to go to taverns and so on and so forth. So he was not the kind of rigorous that we find in Yi Wang. Okay. The last person, of course, these again are all the completed works. Some of these are now translated. You can also find them online. There is a large free open database of Neo-Confucian materials now online. So if you type in Neo-Confucian translations, you probably find most of these now available in English.